Perfect. We're live on YouTube and our recording is going. So, good morning to everyone in Brazil. Good afternoon in Pretoria, South Africa. And I guess good evening already in India. It's very nice that we were able to sort out this time that would fit for everyone for starting this webinar, which is one in a series of webinars, which name is Social Inclusion and Sustainability, Lessons from COVID. I will be the moderator for today, and I will pass the mic to Professor Cassiolato, who is our coordinator and host, for him to say hello to everyone and greet everyone. Before, I would just like to inform more or less what we thought to be the organization of today is that we have a presentation by Professor Rasigan and Professor Dinesh. After that, we will listen to some 20 minutes to the comments of the discussant of today, which is Professor Gabriela Podcameni. And after that, we can open for discussions and everything else. So I would please, Cassiolato, for you to welcome everybody, and then after that, I will introduce the speakers.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Special congratulations to our friends in India and in South Africa. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you all. Let me start saying that in 2005 in Tshwane, very near the cradle of humankind, during the GlobalX conference, we had there organized by our friend Rasigan Maharajh. We announced in GlobalX the idea of having a huge research project on BRICS countries. Later on, we had a further discussion in 2006 in Trivandrum, Kerala, when KJ Joseph organized our GlobalX conference there. And the whole idea of the BRIC project was we're in a very different moment as compared to what we are today. There were lots of hope, and the idea of the BRICS project was to analyze, understand, and make policy proposals about the national system of innovation of our BRICS countries. And within this BRICS country, IBSA, India, Brazil, and South Africa, had a more profound and special relation, in the sense that we had more similar problems in terms of distribution of income, sustainability problems, etc., etc. At that time, since then, we had several discussions of the BRICS and of the IBSA project. The last one was in last January in Tshwane, near Tshwane, when we convened to further discuss our situation, particularly after changes that were happening in the world economy. That became more visible, and nobody, even if we had already news about the COVID in China, we didn't imagine the situation that we are today. And today we are, I'll quote something that Noam Chomsky told 10 years ago during the first summit of the Progressive International, which had a very important overall theme. The theme was internationalism or extinction. And Chomsky told, we are facing the most dangerous moment in human history. And he said, I'm old enough to remember very vividly the threat of the Nazism that could take over much of Eurasia. But even that, horrible enough, was not like the end of organized human life on Earth, which is what we are now facing. That's the situation we are today. It's important for us to keep track what's happening in our countries, and the main aim of this, let's say, couple of webinars we are having this week and next week among IBSA countries is precisely to give us some light on what's happening, and to help us to better understand the situation nowadays and what we are going to have to face in the future in our territories. And then it's very important for us, this meeting, and I really thanks a lot all of our Indian and South African close friends, that we became close friends after 15 years. Thanks very much for being with us. Looking forward to our discussion, and a luta continua. Let's go to the discussion. Please, Marcelo.
Thank you very much. So, as we planned, we'll start with Professor Rasigan Maharajh. Let me briefly introduce our first main speaker. Professor Rasigan is currently Professor Extraordinary of the Center for Research and Evaluation, Science and Technology at Stellenbosch University, Nodal Head of the Department of Science and Technology at the National Research Foundation, Center of Excellence in Scientometrics and Science Technology and Innovation Policy, Founder and Chief Director of the Institute for Economic Research on Innovation at Tshwane University of Technology, an Associate Research Fellow of the Tellus Institute in Boston, and the Chairperson of the Southern Africa Node of the Millennium Project. He was awarded a Doctor of Philosophy degree by the Research Policy Institute, School of Economics and Management in Lund University in Sweden, and he's also an alumnus of the University of KwaZulu-Natal of South Africa and the Harvard Business School of the United States. Rasigan is a ministerial representative on the Council of Rhodes University and an elected senator of Tshwane University of Technology. Since 2004, Rasigan has contributed to more than 65 publications and has presented his research in 42 countries. As you see, we have a person with a lot of experience and a lot of interesting things to tell us. So it's a pleasure to have you with us. Please, Professor Rasigan, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. I just want to check, am I audible, Marcelo?
Sorry?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we're hearing you the same way I told you before, as if there was a pillar on the mic. Eventually, yes. If you speak closer to the mic would help, I don't know. But
yes, that's what I'm trying to do. And so I'm very close now. Any closer and I'll be inside the machine.
So come to us. Would be best.
Yeah. So can I also ask, if you don't mind, Marcelo, can you see my screen? Can you see the slides?
I'm seeing your screen, but it's not sharing on full screen. I'm seeing the app, the program, with the editing commands and so on. Now I'm seeing it full screen perfectly.
Excellent. So with your permission then, I'll move ahead on the presentation itself.
Okay.
So,
you're moving. We're seeing it changing.
Well, thanks very much for the very kind words. You know, there's a lot of resonance between us, as you heard from Professor Cassiolato's introduction as well. And this builds on a lot of work that we've been doing collectively over a considerable amount of time. 15 years is not trivial. And in terms of preparing the presentation that I'm going to share with you, I must, you know, start with a concession, which is I have found the last 6 months to have been extraordinarily difficult. And largely because many of the things that we've been speaking about in the preceding 15 years have now come to confront us in a very harsh and objective form. We are struck by a pandemic as determined by the World Health Organization. But I want to encourage, as I go through the presentation, that you also be encouraged to consider another word, a new word to add to the lexicon. I'm sorry, this is from English itself. And that's the idea of a syndemic as opposed to a pandemic. You see, it's a nuance. It was published in the Lancet last week. And the idea being that we have a syndrome that's attacking us that raises a whole range of ecological, social, economic, and political concerns all together. And we stand the chance of misspecifying, and because of that, narrowing our response if we only think this is a medical issue. So if you keep that in mind through my presentation, I hope to return to it when we get to the concluding points. But I think it's necessary to share with you at least some of the features of what we've had to experience in South Africa over the last 6 months. In sharing this with you, I also want you to be encouraged to take note that the COVID-19 has not created new circumstances. Rather, what COVID-19 has done, it has foregrounded and brought to bear on us with a much higher level of seriousness the problems that we were dealing with over the last almost 25 years since the democratic breakthrough in South Africa in 1994. So in the presentation, I hope some of this material comes across. But I thought a good way and a nice segue to going into the materials itself. A former head of state of Portugal, is currently our Secretary General of the United Nations, on the 18th of July presented the 18th Nelson Mandela Lecture. And inside that lecture was a very significant statement. So I'll encourage you, and if anyone wants a copy of the text or even the video, please drop me an email and I'll share that with you as well. But I think this is a very stark a challenge being placed before us by a political person who ultimately hopes to advance the internationalism that we spoke about earlier. And what Guterres actually raised was, and I like the way in which he said, dear friend, let's face the facts. The global political and economic system is not delivering on critical global public goods. He specified public health, climate action, sustainable development, and peace. And I'm sure all of you would be able to see resonance in each one of those aspects. I think most of that came very starkly to us, especially for those of us that were forced to watch, I think, what was called a debate in the United States of America but 2 days ago. And this highlights the next point. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought home the tragic disconnect between self-interest and common interest. And also then shows us the huge gaps between the ethics, the morality, in fact, our humanity, versus the governance structures that we have socially put in place through which we seek to organize ourselves. There is a contradiction between these governance structures that we've put a lot of effort in and the demands of a decent life for all. In fact, we could even be cynical to say maybe some of what we have in place structurally prevents us even achieving a life at all. And this disease vector has then also removed from the 6.7 billion of us a large number of people. This category of information is very sadly now reflected in data as excess deaths. Now, I will share with you the South African component of it. But let's start with where is South Africa at the moment? From our July data, South Africa now comprises just under 60 million people. The majority of South Africans, as you'll see, are very young. More than 50% of our population is below the age of 27. In fact, our median age is 27 at the moment. And we have then a few people that are in the older group, but it decreases very rapidly. And this is a demographic fact that I would like to return to later, and maybe in the question and discussion, about questions being asked as to why Africa specifically is not following very similar epidemiological trends and patterns that we see, especially in Europe, in parts of more mature Asia, as well as in North America. And this age composition is seen as a significant factor as well. South Africa's population is then very unevenly distributed amongst genders. We are a majority women country. 51% of South Africans are female. And you'll also see then the age structure. And in this, I hope you are noting the huge numbers of people that we have in the categories below the age of 34. And that speaks to, one, a possibility around resilience, but also brings into question at an intergenerational level the type of systems that we've put in place and its impact on the next generation. And here, I want to return to this point about constraints on development. And at the level of epistemology and ontologies, in other words, how we see the world and how we interpret it as well. And we need to be quite careful in terms of responding to the current crisis, that we don't further encumber, we don't further lock up younger generations into ways of doing things that have served our generation well enough, but may be wholly inadequate for the generations that follow us. So, South Africa's approach to the declaration by the World Health Organization of COVID-19 as a global pandemic was to move the country into a new administrative era. And that was specified by the imposition of a national state of disaster. This was imposed just a week after the first positively identified case of COVID-19 in South Africa was detected. And broadly, the strategy was around bending the curve. And I'm sure you've heard this in a variety of forms, even translated across different languages. But in essence, the logic behind this looked at the poor state of our infrastructure, and especially on the capacity of our health system to deal with the possibility of large numbers of people being infected simultaneously and requiring urgent medical attention. So the object, as you'll see in that graphic, was to try to contain and reduce the spread of the infection, and through reducing the spread, have that then over a longer period of time get into health facilities which would have the capacity to treat people. So you'll see there's a putative line in that graphic which says the current health system capacity. So this graphic is taken from a briefing for the ministers. And because we are dealing with this in an academic form, I can make an additional comment, which that line represents an aggregation. The issue about South Africa's current health system capacity is unfortunately bedeviled by the fact that South Africa has a dual system. South Africa has a public health system as well as a private health system. Both coexist within one national territory. But as you'll see when I share more data with you, the one system has higher levels of capabilities, whereas the other system is seen as having an erosion of capacities and capabilities. In other words, the private system seems to fare better than the public system. I think this is an issue we may find across IBSA as well, because of the way in which our economies have chosen market solutions as opposed to building public infrastructures and expanding public goods. So a second aspect of seeking to bend the curve and reduce the number of infections, thereby reduce the numbers of people requiring medical assistance, was quite an elaborate deviation from the Constitution. And this constitutional provision allowed for certain rights that all South Africans enjoy. It's encapsulated in our Bill of Rights. But some of these rights, according to the health and governance ministers, needed to be constrained. And these were specifically to reduce mobility as well as lock people down in their residences. So something like that could not take place under South Africa's very democratic constitution. Hence, government invoked a national state of disaster, which then provided for the establishment of the National Command Council, which was a subcommittee of cabinet, and designated officials could then make regulations which would impose constraints on the ordinary freedoms that South Africans enjoy. It's quite an important point to note because within that also lies contradictions. And the mechanism that South Africa then utilized, in other words, what applied to this governance council, its logic, as well as its intention of containing the spread of the virus in South Africa, was what is called the National Risk-Adjusted Strategy. And this provided for levels of restrictions to be placed on the society. So when the national state of disaster was imposed in March, South Africa moved into level 5. And for each one of these levels, there's a number of indicators. I haven't provided this level of detail, but please be encouraged, should you want to know more about it, to ask me, I will share that with you. But each of these levels, from level 5 to level 1, has a range of indicators and trigger points, which allow them for some level of oversight, some level of democratic participation in ensuring that what should be the common good is served by these restrictions being put in place. At level 5, the entire economy of South Africa was shut down. We are now, for the last 2 to 3 weeks in level 1. But because of the latest data that we've received, and which I will share with you as well, there's a question of whether we may shift back into a higher level of restriction, and largely this is mainly premised on both the numbers of people being infected as well as those losing their lives to the disease vector. So what are our current statistics? And these are our statistics as of the day before. As I mentioned to start, South Africa has nearly 60 million people, not in any way comparable scale-wise with our colleagues in Brazil and India. But of the 60 million people, to date, about 4.2 million people have been tested. Out of this 4.2 million people that were tested, 674,000 were identified as positive carriers of COVID-19. But phenomenally, 608,000 of those are now recognized as having recovered from being infected with COVID-19. So because of that, and I find it very difficult in terms of recounting these numbers because they are morbid. We have 16,734 people in South Africa that we officially designate as having died because of COVID-19. And that trigger point I mentioned to you, which national government may need to invoke again, was because yesterday 1,767 new cases were added to the total cases in South Africa. You'll also see the distribution. Some of the provinces, specifically Gauteng, Western Cape, and KwaZulu-Natal. So KwaZulu-Natal has a large population. Gauteng has the largest population. And naturally, those two areas have large numbers of cases confirmed. You'll see in terms of those that died because of COVID-19, it follows a kind of progression where KwaZulu-Natal has half the number of deaths relative to the Western Cape and Gauteng. The Western Cape and Gauteng have about the same number of deaths, but I hope you notice in the Western Cape, that number of deaths was on a much lower number of cases. Out of 110,000 people that were infected, 4,182 died. In Gauteng, out of 219,000, 4,200 died. So this speaks to, as well, some of the inequalities between the provinces and very specifically the demographic profiles in terms of class, in terms of racialized category, in terms of gender between these provinces. I also want to point out some information that is provided by our National Institute for Communicable Diseases. And this I find completely shocking, and it's something that South Africa needs to take much more seriously in terms of thinking of the future. As I mentioned to you, we have a dual system health-wise, a public system and a private system. But if you look at the capacity to test, not only having the capital equipment, but also the capabilities, the skilled technicians to conduct the test, you'll see the huge anomaly. The public sector, which caters for the majority of the population, only did approximately a third of the most recent tests and under half of the total test to date. So this points to serious problems that we have in terms of the public sector's capacity. It also speaks to the fact that the private sector has been able to not only mobilize the resources, but probably compensate the capabilities and thereby attract such capabilities into their sector. All of this at the expense of the public. Now, I raise this as a major concern because when we think about the future and what happens post-COVID, a significant issue is whether we need to maintain and continue such a bifurcation. Is it really possible that the COVID virus or the viral vector has a scanning device or has an ability to check whether someone is in the private health system or the public health system and then attack them on that basis? No, colleagues, I'm sure you all know very well that that's not true and that's not the case. We are all affected by it, but some of us achieve higher levels or higher levels of care relative to others. And that is something, that's a social decision. And hence I mentioned the Guterres contrast between the ethics and our praxis today. We really need to rethink many things because of what COVID-19 is teaching us. So here's the other morbid picture. And in this, you'll also see across the levels of lockdown. So please excuse the numbering. It should be in a reverse form, but they did this to maintain a type of progression. So under level 5, which is the first block that you see, it's indicated as weak lockdown level 5 introduced. Yes, that's the point, 25th of March. Between the 25th of March and sometime early towards the end of April, under lockdown level 5, the most restricted level, you'll see that the numbers of people being infected and those dying was seriously that's when we see an increase in the number of people dying again. And this was maintained right across. You'll also see an anomaly in South Africa. Both smoking and the consumption of alcohol was banned. The restriction on alcohol use was removed and immediately led to an increase in numbers of deaths. The smoking ban was not removed. The smoking ban was only relaxed under level 1, which is just a few weeks old now. So this gives us, again, a sense of us being able to correlate the type of systems we have in place to manage behavior and then actually being able to monitor real behavior. What we've learned from this in monitoring excess deaths is that the impact specifically of alcohol on behavior far exceeds the type of economic or commercial return that the alcohol industry advances as the reason not to restrict or prohibit access to and use of alcohol. These are important questions, but with a stronger form in which we can respond to them. So, in terms of looking at some of the real impacts then, as the pandemic showed across South Africa, you will see from the sectoral shares of gross domestic product. I've tried to combine a lot of data into the following slides. So you will see that it's not just the share of GDP, but within that, the amount of people employed. So if you have a sense of this picture, employment and its contribution to gross domestic product, and we're already noting we have a challenge with gross domestic product, etc., but this is the data that we have in hand, and it is descriptive and illustrative for our purposes. What have the changes been? And you'll see this in terms of employment. In community and social services over the last quarter, we lost almost 500,000 jobs. In the sector, industrial sector of trade, almost 375,000 jobs were lost, and you'll see that curve. The lowest declines in employment were actually in what would be called Department 1, capital-intensive sectors which produce our electricity, that do minerals extraction, as well as produce agriculture. They were the least affected by COVID-19 in terms of employment data. The labor market also experienced a massive change, and I don't want to get into the quibbles between the narrow definition of employment and unemployment imposed by the International Labour Organization. I would rather encourage a view. 14.1 million South Africans currently earn wages and salaries in the economy. That's their source of livelihood. 20.6 million South Africans are not economically active. In other words, do not receive wages or salary. You add that to the 4.3 officially designated as unemployed, and that gives us the total of people outside of this distribution of livelihoods through the wage relationship. It is a massive number if we were to compare the almost 25 million versus just 14.1 million people that are employed. So if we look at that now in detail, this 20.6 million people, we get a sense of some people, of course, are in education, students, some are involved in domestic reproduction, and that's a troubling number as well. I raise that with you because in all instances, domestic labor or labor used to reproduce all of us is not and does not attract wages or a salary. So that's unpaid work that contributes to reproducing ourselves. You'll see the rest of it. We've seen this massive increase, as you see, between Q1 and Q2 in those discouraged from seeking work. So important around these issues. And now for the 14.1 million that are employed, you'll see the shift. And the shift meant that those involved in categories of work which were more industrially orientated, all had to report to their place of employment to access the work itself and the wages that followed from it. You see all of those related trade, basic categories of jobs, sales and services, plant, machine operations, domestic work, all of those demanded that people work in their factories or sites of production. Whereas those categories which were professional and semi-professional got the opportunity to work from home. This again gives you a sense in terms of how class privilege advantaged those with higher levels of especially certification, but those in salaried professions. Whereas those that were dependent on wages, because they were unable, because of the restrictions, to get to their workplaces, and officially their workplaces were closed, a lot of them suffered not being able to earn incomes. So from that empirical sense, I want to then jump into just the last two slides. Here with you then, what are we drawing out of this? So I think our colleagues at the Institute for Economic Justice and our institute, IERI, works very closely with the colleagues at IEJ. So we're very supportive of this argument. The South African government was initially praised for taking such proactive and aggressive steps to flattening the curve, what I explained to you as the logic. But this logic, which placed this undue burden, as you saw, and the uneven effects of that burden on South Africa's population, has now been undermined by the realization that those responsible for managing our economy either don't have the wherewithal to appreciate it, or are so locked into merely repeating to us mantras of the market that they refuse to see the reality and what the reality demands of them. We still have a Reserve Bank that has not opened up the economy against the advice of civil society. South Africa has taken a loan from multilateral agency, including the International Monetary Fund, which will then impose conditionalities in terms of how we rebuild after COVID-19. For most of us, we believe this was a cynical move made specifically to exclude popular participation in determining the post-COVID-19 recovery period. So our colleagues again produced an excellent textbook I would gladly share with you, explaining in detail these 6 main points of the recovery. Number 1, to reclaim and rebuild public services. Number 2, and I hope, Gabby, you also pick up this point, there's a new frame here, complementing the green economy with the purple economy. I'll explain more when we come to the details, but it is ecologically orientated. It ties to the 3rd bullet point, which is the absolute requirement of transitioning to a low-carbon energy system and integrating this into the green economy and as an aspect of the public services that we build. A very nice way of framing this, we would have, in our own circles, between RedeSist, KJ, India Lakes, Africa Lakes, South Africa, ourselves in IERI, we would have framed this as a problem of the political economy. But the way in which, in a broader sense, then, this is now put forward. 1, we want transformation, not just reform. Very important. Because reform means that the form had a veracity and was delivering good products and services to you. This is not the case. Also, we want to do this to effectively change the ownership structures through which power is deployed in the economy. A balance of forces has to be changed. We cannot continue along this, as I'll make the point in the next slide as well. And it ends on the point of a complete commitment to multilateralism against unilateralism. And here we're speaking specifically about the hegemonic force that can't even hold a debate about their future leader. We have to build a new internationalism. It's worse than barbarism that faces us, Cassiolato. So, by way of conclusion, I hope you don't mind, something which doesn't usually come from our literature, but it's from the humanities. And I just love the way in which they put this across. It's from an arts and letters collective called The Locust. I would like to read it for you. In March came the plague, COVID-19. By the time you read this, the pandemic and the economic crisis that triggered and exacerbated, but did not cause, will have raged for months. For us in South Africa, this was 6 months. We find ourselves in a new terrain, a new world, but one fundamentally the product of the world that existed before. That was the point I hope I managed to share with you with a lot of underlining. With capital determined to maintain, if not accelerate, the rate of surplus value extraction, in contradiction to the needed public health policy, the conflict between use and exchange value was demystified for countless workers across the planet. Very important. We now know who is essential. And we also know the large numbers of non-essential, predatory and parasitic elements of society, largely under the guise of capital. So to reiterate what the United Nations Secretary General has told us, we are not all in the same boat, even though we are in the same storm. And I think this affords us, especially in our community within Globelix, those of us concerned with the economics of learning, innovation, and competence building systems, that we rethink with a critical lens that relationship between R&D, science, technology, knowledge, innovation, industry, and education. Why? because the clamor around intellectual property and the enclosure of new knowledge for the benefit of what's considered vaccine nationalism is ridiculous and has no validity in science. The idea that one country is going to protect itself by having vaccines for its population while the rest of us incubate the disease makes no sense. So the idea about safeguarding and extending the global knowledge commons, I think, falls back to us as a task. We need to rebuild solidarity and collaboration. This is more than just a third mission of universities. And please be encouraged, there's a link there to a range of civil society organizations in South Africa called the People's Coalition, and right across from the use of violence, gender-based issues, right through to ecology and clean transition. Many groups have put forward views representing voices of the people, not voices just of capital or of governments. And that brings me to the final point, which you've heard me say so many times, maybe I need not repeat it. We must really revise our prospects. We cannot continue operating in the form in which we've operated that makes us prone to such zoonotic diseases. These diseases themselves result from the ecological practices that we are practicing. The destruction in the Amazon, the continued reduction of biodiversity, all of these contribute to making the world not what we want, not what we need, and definitely not what we, the people, demand, rather serving the object of maintaining power relations and mode of production as it stands. Thank you very much. Thanks for your attention, and thanks for allowing me the extra few minutes, Marcelo. I think I may have stepped beyond my allocation. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Professor. Don't worry about that. It was very interesting to hear you. So let's move on. I suggest we hear our second speaker, which is Professor Dinesh Abrol, and after that we get into discussions and so on. Let me first briefly introduce our second speaker. If he allows me, I will try to pick up some highlights of his bio, which is very extensive. But Professor Abrol is member of the TRCSS GENU and coordinator of the South Asia Sustainability Studies Hub and Knowledge Network, a collaborative program of STEP Center of IDS SPRU, University of Success, and Jawaharlal Nehru University, GENU, of New Delhi, advisor of the Pharmaceutical Export Council of India in Hyderabad, in the province of Hyderabad. He has lots of publications on science, technology, and society and innovation studies, covering a broad range of topics like FDI and National System of Innovation, intellectual property rights, policy, research evaluation, studies on research and technology for development, universities, technology assessment, technology implementation, studies on social movements, knowledge production, grassroots innovations, sustainability and self-reliance, studies on pharmaceuticals, biomedical research, agriculture, rural industries, higher education, public-funded R&D programs, science policy, and so on. Recently, he has 3 books, 6 monographs, 20 research reports, and 60 research papers to his credit in the field of science, technology, innovation, and development studies. And I would also highlight recent research activities, which fit very well to our current discussions, connected to South Asian Sustainability Hub of the STEPS Center of Transdisciplinary Research Cluster on Sustainability Studies in GENU, New Delhi, a project on grassroots innovation movements project in India, the ISSC research program on urban sustainability, water and waste water in southern NCR, Gurgaon in India, on technology implementation for water and waste water treatment system in Gurgaon, on outward foreign direct investment of Indian pharmaceutical industries. So I just picked up some of the details of a very extensive CV you sent me, and I apologize for that. It's just for the audience to get to know you, know about what you're doing, what your fields of interest are. So please, Professor, thank you very much for being with us, and the stage is yours.
Yeah, Marcelo, I'll request you to put the presentation so that but I'll start in the meanwhile while you are putting out the presentation for people to look at. Okay.
Yes, please.
Firstly, I'm really grateful to friends in Brazil, and also I must thank Rasigan for having taken the floor first and really set the ball rolling, and he's really made my job quite easy. See, a lot in common with South Africa that I can describe in terms of the way things have evolved after COVID was identified, let us put it this way. Though there is a controversy saying whether it was there from even earlier period before even WHO declared it as a pandemic, and this particular declaration, as far as India is concerned, unlike elsewhere, can be dated as December 30th. Since then, we are now in October. Today is October 1st. We have almost now close to 6.5 million confirmed cases, and we have I think the latest data which I just now saw on the net shows that about close to what is called 1 lakh, that's a 0.1 million deaths, the fatalities that India has recorded, and there might have been more fatalities but which have not been recorded, and that's the case I think in the rest of the world as well. But given our own systems, so one can say that not all deaths would have been recorded. And there was a lot of issues also with regard to whether this is the COVID deaths actually or COVID-induced triggered other deaths which also could be noted. But excess deaths, yes, took place during this particular period. 40 million internal migrants were affected, and I think those the world knows through a variety of stories which appeared in international press that the migrants who were there in metros to work in casual employment, in a non-standard employment, were actually left stranded. In fact, the destructive effects of COVID-19 in India don't need to be attributed to COVID itself, but more actually should be traced to the nature of the government response, and even I would say in certain sense even the societal response, which one can include in analysis. The lockdown undertaken in India was completely without planning, and it was done at a notice of 3 hours, and it couldn't contain the virus. It couldn't contain the spread of the virus. That's very, very clear, because during the lockdown period, the number of people who were affected was much, much smaller, and since then it has really exponentially grown. Now, if one has to take into account the consequences of that, I think it's very clear that, as was mentioned by Rasigan, that everyone is equal is not true, and structures and regimes have certainly mattered, and the responses on this COVID front in particular determined the consequences. Stay-at-home policies, which were really announced as a main non-pharmaceutical intervention route was not effective for 90% of the people who lived in densely populated areas, be in cities or even in rural areas. So it was in fact counterproductive in many ways, because most of these people who constitute 90% of the Indian population stayed in places which could not maintain physical distance and did not have means to even, let us say, avoid contact because there were hardly any, facilities of sanitation. There were no toilets, which they had to share, and so on, etc., in large numbers, and couldn't have avoided contact with each other. So there is one particular aspect which when I was listening to Rasigan, came to my mind, maybe worth mentioning, that as far as Indian public health system is concerned, healthcare system, and let me make it more clear, was relatively speaking far more, in operation than what I heard just now from Rasigan when it came to South Africa. In fact, our private systems tried avoiding the responsibility of dealing with, COVID cases. They wanted actually no COVID patient to come to the metro hospitals. They actually wanted to be left alone as far as the private practitioners, pathology labs, all of them were closed. In fact, the responsibility had to be borne mainly by the public healthcare system as far as concerned. But public health cannot be, healthcare is, as in this particular case, only when the cases go, you can't, the treatment is simple quarantine and isolation. Not much remedies or therapies were available, and the only thing the system could do, that is apart from contact tracing and isolation and so on, etc., do testing and then see how quarantine and isolation can be planned. And as a consequence, yeah.
Please tell me when I should shift the slides.
Yeah, I will. So I'm just trying to bring home to the point that structures do matter, the regimes do matter, be in healthcare or in this place. And our understanding of public health is that if the social determinants are badly organized, as they were, nutrition, or it was sanitation, access to water, access to safe shelter, home. Since it was wanting, as a result, really most of the cases which, as we now see, growing, though not that there are not cases in middle class houses and otherwise, but people who have really suffered are people who are poor, people who've been living in this particular colony, and their social determinants got aggravated further because these people couldn't stay home and they couldn't get access to even the basic entitlements, and as a result, they decided to move. And these were heart-rending. The scenes, 40 million internal migrants affected is not a small number. And they were all walking to states sometimes by cycle, by all kinds of means. There were no buses, there were no trains, transport systems were completely shut. And the consequence was that the conscience of the middle class to some extent was touched. And I think some response came at the societal level, but at the same time, we also saw at the societal level a certain kind of, virtually, I would say, apartheid. A social divide was huge. There was stigma, there was prejudice, there was fear, and this particular phenomena of prejudice, fear, we saw it in many ways playing out as far as is concerned. And we have a government which at the moment people know, I think, enough about it as far as it's concerned, made a big case that some Wahibi Tablighi sect people who were there in India at that particular point of time were not checked at the international airports, and the proper attention and care was not taken, and but they were made the villains of the peace, and they were actually blamed, and as they in fact were a very small factor, and COVID challenge was nowhere attributable to them, but it was attributed, and it was attributed by the ruling party. It was attributed from the whole Hindutva right-wing brigade, as far as it's, and we created a whole kind of prejudice against even the labor in general. The what we call them people in labor are of lower caste, and there's already in structures there is a discrimination. So with those kind of structures that the response got determined, and the government response of course was very, very pathetic, to say that they centralized in every possible way both the Epidemics Act of 1897 as well as the National Disaster Management Act of 2005. They invoked, and centralization was done, but centralization was used for more control and I would say even deception and denial rather than actually coordinating and providing care as far as is concerned. I would like to go to the next slide, please, Marcelo. Thank you. Please, I have given you a brief background of how the government response actually was tragic, and because of that, there's 90% of the Indian labor which lives under informal structure faced the struggle for food, hygiene, health, and home, and that is not over as yet. The indifference and injustice is continuing, and uncertainty prevails with regard to all facets of life on account of COVID. Economic recovery is going to be very slow, and more than and the reasons are there that the access to really livelihood opportunities has declined considerably. I was looking at the data yesterday by the CMEI, the Center for Monitoring of Indian Economy, as far as is concerned. Close to 8 million employment has been affected, meaning lost in variety of ways. As if you look at itself, even the white collar jobs, which is 4.4 million jobs, have been lost during this particular period. And livelihoods, if you look, because majority of the people don't have formal employment, livelihoods are concerned, they're very adversely impacted in so many ways that if one starts describing that, it would take a full hour. For me to even give you a glimpse of what is happening with regard to the economic recovery. So if I move to the next slide, and I'll give you some idea, please, Marcelo, the next slide, please. The National Statistical Office has reported a 24% fall in the GDP, gross domestic product, for the second quarter of 2020, which is higher than the contraction reported for all countries where the pandemic was severe. Private consumption down by 27%, investment down by 47%. They've really, both consumption and investment have been severely hit. A significant fall in employment and incomes has been noticed. If you go to the next slide, please, Marcelo, I'll bring out that as I said, deception and denial have been the policy in some sense, but propaganda cannot be policy. If you look at finally, though there have been claims about the V-shaped recovery being possible, but even that optimism misses the point that contraction in output COVID retreat is still at least 6 months away. Lockdown of the economic activity will be continuing. A quick return to the normal levels of capacity utilization is unlikely. And this is because of the fact that the government has been really not willing to make a fiscal intervention. It's continuing its monetarism-driven policy of implementing FRBM, the fiscal budget responsibility, which means deficit should not go beyond 3%. And that decline, we can see that though at this particular point of time could have been, dealt with if the public administration and state was actually willing to cross the Rubicon of fiscal deficit and really make more fiscal intervention. But that fiscal intervention has not come, and the data shows that in fact the initial relief package which was announced, it was only 1%. Now, then subsequent claims have been made that the 10% of GDP has been, used in the relief package that has been, the intervention that has been announced, apart from the various reforms, neoliberal reforms, which I will come to. In that maximum calculation is that 3% of the GDP is really the fiscal intervention. 7% is actually liquidity. Largely, it's a part of it is credit guarantee. Some interest payments might get protected for the banking system to be saved. But otherwise, it's a liquidity or the supply side measures as far as concerned. Fiscal intervention is really small. The decline in income was happening even earlier, and I think that's a very important point because of demonetization, which the government actually tried out in the name of fighting terror money and corruption and so on, etc. But or they were saying that they'll put 15 lakhs, that is about 1.5 million rupees in everybody's account. That is on that promise that they came to power. And forget about even 15 paisa being put in the people's accounts. We have seen over the period the decline in income because of both demonetization as well as GST, which was basically pro-big business measure it turned out to be. And even whatever consequences we have seen because of those two measures, which are really talked about measures in India, the real income decline for the vast numbers of working people had existed. The rate of chronic unemployment in 2018-19, which they tried hiding for very, very long, was the highest ever in last 45 years, and at 6% compared to the usual 2 to 3%. So the per capita real consumption expenditure in rural India, according to another statistics national sample survey of 2017-18, was 9% lower than in 2011-12. So you can clearly see that COVID came on the top of already a decline in income happening there because of the policy that they had implemented from 2014 onward. And if next slide, Marcelo, you take, please. I'll move on to the next slide to really bring out the policy matters as far as propaganda would not work. So absolute decline in employment is unprecedented, getting further accentuated due to the wrong policy. And wrong policies on lockdown, I explained it, how it happened and how the preparation was not done. And similarly, also the fiscal relief package, what is called actually Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan. That is the label that is self-reliance, which was a Nehruvian phrase, self-reliance. India figured out import substitution under that particular measure. It's selectively dealing from the rest of the global economy, colonial economy as it was. We know that. And that particular phrase has been now invoked as far as is concerned. And the name of that particular thing, actually opening up to the big business is very, very common. And I'll come to it. You will see the kind of details which are available now are astounding. They're really worrying and disturbing in a variety of ways. But the central government at the same time, in terms of the governance, has been striking at federalism. And a good example, which I will give you, last year itself, before even the COVID, there was a promise that they would be compensating the states. And Joseph is sitting here. He's been really at the forefront on with Isaac, my good friend, the finance minister of Kerala, fighting the battle on this particular front. And I think this battle is still very much on, and we do not know where it will lead us to. But the real impact of that is that the state governments did not get the compensation from the central government. Central government did not give it last year, and now for this year, they have invoked the act of God perspective on saying that, and as a result, the states are not being paid their compensation. So the act of God doctrine invoked to deny compensation is a case before the Supreme Court, and we do not know the way institutions are working in India, what kind of decision would come, but the battle is on. As far as whatever funding systems were created in that, the strange part was there was a PM Cares Fund which was created, and in which many of us were donating pensions, part of the salaries, and that's not very transparent. And its funds have been misutilized, I would say. In fact, there's a case which is already in the papers, a ventilator case where 300 crore plus scam is being talked about. I don't want to talk about it more. Let the investigation go on. But the state governments were not even allowed to collect corporate social responsibility or other funds from their, state governments do not have money to pay salaries and meet other obligations. And it's across the case. It's even in Kerala, the finance minister has had to really work out a whole roadmap for that particular purpose. And I'm sure Joseph can even share the details of it, the kind of challenge that even a government like Kerala, which has really performed better, because given the nature of its history of public health system and its more democratic institutions that which permitted the, even when contestation is there, the contact tracing is easy because mutual monitoring is easier. And I'm sure when Joseph speaks in the next thing, he's going to get into the details of many of these particular advantages which Kerala had. But even Kerala state have faced this particular challenge, and they have to reduce the salaries. They have to ask for a cut and people to save. So, see, in fact, if you look at the kind of demands which have been made in the country from all sides of economists, differences are only up to saying how the expenditure should be financed. The public expenditure should be financed. But everybody is in favor of public expenditure to be undertaken as far as the government should be intervening. Left economists have, of course, recommended that wealth tax and inheritance tax and so on, etc., should be used to actually, take care of the fall in the revenue. And of course, the right-wing economists, or you call them whatever economists they are, think that leave money in the hands of the wealth creators, and they will actually create a boom. But we know that the Great Depression of the interwar year lasted for a decade, and poverty will increase in the meanwhile, and the suffering will be there. And the present dispensation is, in the meanwhile, would utilize the polarization of social nature to gather electoral support, and may continue even for longer period using that kind of means, but rather than really giving really solutions to the people. Next slide, please, Marcelo. Yeah. See, in fact, today, if you want to look at the stories about India in the international press, they would be about farmers' protests are accelerating. Because in the meanwhile, what government brought 3 ordinances and dealing with the Essential Commodity Act, which actually used to provide stock limits. And as a result, hoarding was to be controlled and so on, etc., by the middleman and others, including the agribusiness. Second is the contract farming related ordinance, which has been converted onto bill. The third one is the market, the agri. If you look at all these areas, these 3 ordinances, they are actually aimed at increasing the domination of the agribusiness further. And it's not surprising that Adani, which is Adani and Ambani are 2 names, those start with both A, but they are not really A1 people who they are actually aggrandizing for very, very long and have built their monopolies. And FCI, the Food Corporation of India, which has been really building stocks in itself, its logistic network has been handed over to Adani's. They are already in food processing. Adani's are in ports, they are in seaports, they are in shipping, they are in across the thing. Reliance is in retail, Adani is also in retail, and e-commerce, etc., etc. All these areas, some details may further come in some of the slides as far as it's concerned. But the short point is that the food grain stocks were building up precisely during this particular period, but they were not distributed. They were actually For friends in Brazil, it would be something familiar that, but at the same time surprising, that in the midst of the COVID, Indian government wanted to convert food grains into ethanol, as far as it's concerned, rather than really distributing food grains to people who needed it. And we were entitlements were not given. Even the ones which were announced did not reach. And there are enough statistics available on that how the a very small percentage of people actually got their entitlement, which were announced. But even they were very small, below what was demanded. Persistent excess supply because the real income in the hands of the people not there. And even the private trade was not, as a result, picking up food grain, and as a result, the stocks were building up. So, but the universal PDS, if had been taken up, it could have actually easily, allowed people to also gain. And even using food grains, you can also build a Maharajh program, that is the rural employment guarantee, which can actually provide not only common public goods as well as even relief in the meanwhile. If next slide, please. Farmers' protests are precisely at the moment today the main news in this in India, and I think as a result, the ruling dispensation is worried about it. But at the same time, if you see there, while they are worried about it, but they have not gone back on their actually strategy. They have also passed, after passing those 3 ordinances as bills which were related to agriculture, they also now passed 3 codes. One on industrial relations, social security, and occupational safety, health and working conditions. In every case, you see further deregulation of capital with regard to labor. So no binding minimum wage, penalties reduced to paltry fines, essential judicial functions shifted to executive. So it is the district magistrate and some clerks, deputy secretary, who would be deciding whether there has been really a violation of the formal of any of the labor regulations and so on, etc. The trade union activity, bargaining power, all would be impacted hugely as far as it's concerned. There's a privatization of public assets and capabilities simultaneously taking place. And let me mention a few of them, which are really the common public goods: coal, rail, power, banking. They are under the banner of privatization. And contract farming means land is under, which is again a fictitious commodity, converted otherwise is really a common, which people only have, the custodians have a responsibility to maintain soil and water and biodiversity health. Then only this world, there's only one planet, there's no planet B. And in this particular planet, if we are not able to maintain our land health, so then there is a huge challenge as far as this is concerned. Financialization of accumulation. The stock market is booming, and I think that's happening in the US as well, and it's happening in India. And free trade agreements are being signed. So in fact, there is no pushback on neoliberalism. There is a further advancement of neoliberalism. And if you look at, India has chosen to, go the route of become aligning with Quad to contain China. And India's conflict with China, though it can be, I think it was dealt with. It was on border and so on, etc. If you look at, if you look at that particular thing, after all, for long after 1962, no more major conflict has happened. Some small events happened in 1987, 1995, but largely the border has been quiet. And China and India, in fact, in terms of trade and so on, etc., have and investment relations have had a golden period, if I can also put it that way. But of course, there are a variety of problems with that, even the word which I have used, because within that kind of policy, the dependence necessarily is not, the way it has been built is not necessarily the best interdependence that one can really see between two large nations as far as is concerned. So this whole period which has been used, as a result, more opening up, more invitation to the FDI, and as a result, to satisfy them, in the environmental impact assessment amendment. In fact, one of the major fight which is going on, the coal mine should not be open for commercial purposes. It should be for really whatever coal is required in our thermal power stations, and it should be done under public sector. That's a major fight going on at the moment. Similarly, in power stations and in rail privatization, power already was privatized quite a lot. Rail is now the first the target. Banking is under the some of the banks have been consolidated, but it's under the hammer of privatization. Electricity Act itself, 2003, is trying to facing tremendous opposition from 11 states, and it's trying to put the liability of the private sector and the risk all on the public. Next slide, please, Marcelo. Yeah, if you look at, in fact, this whole question of social inclusion, when we're looking at, as far as this is concerned, we've looked at the economy, we've looked at, but if I look at education, in fact, the new education policy, which was again announced only this particular, but again is an attempt to centralize education, privatize education, sectorizing, commodifying school and higher education. In 2009, we had one what is called Right to Education Act, not the best act, but at the same time, it actually made education a right, and people could go to the court both to contain rise in fees as well as ensure that access is there in their neighborhood given. And schools were supposed to obliged to actually practice 25% reservation also for thing, and for which the government was supposed to pay. So all the private unaided schools came under that particular act. Now this particular policy seeks to actually go back on it as far as concerned. In this particular policy, we've had a huge discussion at the moment, and I think it's very, very clear that there is no space for affirmative action in this particular policy. If you look at the the history of the Indian education struggle over the last 3 decades, it was for affirmative action. So there is in fact a social counter-revolution in making in the policy domain with regard to education, gender. The girls would be actually the first ones to be affected. Lower caste would be really, lower classes would be suffering, and the whole set of details education policy, that's a major area of work which I engage in, and one has written on this. But very clearly, in fact, the girls are going to suffer because families who are already suffering under COVID, they would be withdrawing girls from because they would be taking care of siblings and so on, etc. And also, if the cost is going up, then that's the next slide, please, Marcelo. Let me move from education. In education, I must mention one particular point, and you don't need to change the slide. That is, today, digital divide is huge in the country as far as it's concerned. In fact, 2% of the people only have smartphones. Not everybody, though a lot of mobile phones, but not everybody has a smartphone. Access to internet and connectivity is huge. And today, the schools and universities are closed, and access to education. And so this whole generation is going to be impacted hugely as far as it's concerned. And digital online education is no substitute for actually education. I don't need to really discuss this in this particular forum. Everybody knows it. Let me shift from health to health as far as it's concerned. See, as I pointed out that, over the period, what we have seen, weakening of the public health system, though they were the best to go to during the COVID period, but their capacity was really over the period weakened to such an extent that the chinks showed. The fault lines were very, very clear even there as far as is concerned. As a result, some of the ministers, and bureaucrats and officials then would take, beds in private hospitals, and they would be headlines, and they were the headlines in the country at that particular point of time, because the public health system was really under stress. and because it has been weakened, its capacity was not growing. If you look at the way the whole testing, in fact, and the scientific advice on containment was dealt with in the Indian Council of Medical Research, and Rasigan will remember in the last meeting, which where I was in, I think that was a National Innovation Advisory Council, if I recall that body, where we met, and we have started depending on consultants, rather than actually really on our publicly funded institutions and scientific research systems and so on, etc. And this time the role played by the Boston Consulting Group was quite significant. In fact, they did not know much about India. Many of those young girls, women, boys, and experts from abroad, they've really not been in touch with the people of this particular country. And they advised lockdown, and it was not the advice of the epidemiologists. The epidemiologists like Jacob Jones, Sarup Sarkar, Syanthan Banerjee, Mandal, all of them, in fact, wrote a piece in February, and I published that particular piece, COVID-19 Science and Governance, Lessons from India, showed that how that particular advice was ignored. Similarly, on testing, RT-PCR, which is a gold standard test for this particular thing, hardly utilized as far as this is concerned. If you look at in all these cases, it's an NSCI, yes, Rasigan, yes, right, you are. So, if you look at this whole disciplining of state level systems also, throughout this particular period, whether they can open up or not, whether they can decide on their own containment zones or not, the whole thing was centralized. There was a lot of secrecy. In fact, the Ministry of Health used to give everyday press conference, and in that the ICMR used to be present, Indian Council of Medical Research. After a particular point of time, they were asked to leave. And there are a whole set of stories which I can share with you because my students are working there, and many of them are involved in that, and one is getting to know what's happening there as far as it's concerned. But going by, even the structures, if you look at, see, in the last 5 years, this particular government and even the previous government had depended on insurance-based access. There is the whole Ayushman program, which actually is an assurance program, but based on insurance, and it did not work. Commodification of health data is the new thing because that data would be mined by the companies consulting new startups, which are linked to large companies, hospitals, etc. And they are trying to take over this. So, at the continuing neglect of social determinants to which I refer, nutrition, hygiene, sanitation, and habitat, etc., as they were really poorly and badly performing, and as a result, people who have actually suffered are living in those densely populated areas and poor. But the surprising part is now the government wants to move on legislation of population control. And if you look at the legislation which has been moved, the bill which has been moved, it is basically to deprive the poor of their democratic right. If they'll have more than 2 children, they won't be able to contest elections, they won't be able to participate in different bodies at all levels as far as it's concerned. And the various benefits also they would be denied in terms of whether it's in jobs or other benefits which are supposed to be accruing to them. If you take, so this kind of undemocratic, authoritarian, populist politics is being unveiled in the name of COVID, as far as taking advantage of COVID. Please, next slide, please, Marcelo. If you look at, so many disorders are in making. In fact, digital elections, Bihar election is announced already, and there's no level playing field. In fact, if you look at the electoral bonds, which was one of the policy which is brought by this particular policy, 90% of the electoral bond, which is the corporate money with the election, has gone to the ruling party. So you can imagine this, how the electoral campaign is going to be undertaken with the help of various access to online tools. And Facebook is already under challenge here. Delhi government called it, Facebook did not appear. Now the case is in the Supreme Court. Facebook has been helping the ruling party. Surveillance capitalism, is there. Many of us are ourselves charged under UAPA. I myself have been interrogated as far as is concerned. We are people, if dissenting or writing, immediately the hammer is put on young people. We are able to take on, but the younger people are really being pushed and pulled. And there were anti-CA protests. I do not know whether friends would remember that in India, there was a Citizen Amendment Act made, which was again on the lines of Samir is there. Samir has been monitoring this, and I'm sure other friends have been monitoring it. In this case, a lot of young people have been now arrested. In fact, those who have observed this particular thing, the whole thing was creation of the ruling party. And the protests were completely constitutional, and they were in the defense of the Indian secularism and the democracy. But people who have been are punished, who really just who were protested, and all kinds of charges have been put on that. This is a handmaiden for authoritarian populism. COVID, you cannot protest. Two Dalit girls were gang raped in the last 2 weeks, and this is in Uttar Pradesh, one of the largest provinces. And the body of the one girl who was gang raped was yesterday only cremated without even the family, as far as is there. This kind of terror, authoritarian populism is very much the storyline for India at the moment, as far as is concerned. At the same time, you have the digital and the telecom oligarchs emerging. Amazons and Walmart and Flipkarts and the Reliance and the Adani are growing in their assets and wealth. And if you really, this particular Reliance seeking control over power and petroleum, that reminds me of Alende. The logistic network was in the hand of transnational corporations, and how they use that to bring down Alende government, as far as it's concerned. In this particular country, if there's a whole possibility of any democratic government coming, what these corporates, oligarchs would do, only one can speculate at this particular moment. Monopolies are in making, fragmentation of production taking place, restructuring of employment, and bargaining power of labor has really experienced. But of course, the challenges are out there to also to organize the informal sector, a lot of self-employed. I'll come to that particular story later. Marcelo, please, the next slide, please. Yeah, there's a premature deindustrialization has been in progress. That though there was a manufacturing in public sector, and that is going to be now privatized as far as is concerned. And over the period, really, if you look at, in fact, I remember both Helena, Jose, Gabriela, every friend saying, you have public sector manufacturing in India, which was not there in some of the Latin American countries, including in Brazil. So this particular public sector manufacturing is really been under it was defended, and even when the UPA government came in, and some of the steps were taken, and it was really revitalized. In fact, the private corporate sector performance is worse, and compared to that, the public sector has done much better as far as, despite the fact that the government has not been the owner of the thing, which is on behalf of the people. They own the public sector and they run it, and they have actually been a lot of policies in detail what one can share. And I wrote a piece in Frontline just recently, 2 months ago. It can be searched. Myself and Thomas Franco, who are actually organizing together the campaign on public sector, we wrote a piece in Frontline, which is you can go to the internet and you will find that particular piece on public sector. What kind of policies were followed, and what the benefits accrue, and now how that is being dismantled, and so on, etc. Imports really grew during this particular period. So as a result, the industry, and if you look at the manufacturing and the services link, was broken, and much of the services growth has import dependent as well. Even our ICT growth, the information and communication technology. If you look at even the new Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, the self-reliant India program, is not a discontinuity in structural terms. In fact, if you look at subsequent slides, I will indicate that. Marcelo, please, next slide, sir. Yeah, if you look at Indian economy as far as is concerned, and let me draw your attention to the right-hand side of the thing. Rural, urban, informal enterprises. Some stylized fact. Rural owned account enterprises, which are account for 91% of 4% of the unincorporated non-agricultural enterprise. They have a share of 76.45% of the informal employment. Informal employment, I've already talked, is 90% plus. In fact, Jyoti Ghosh, I was reading last week a paper where she indicates the figure of 95, in fact, percent. Urban own account enterprises. These are all enterprises which are self-employed people, one worker, helper, etc. These are the kind of enterprise. So these are the 76.7% of the non-agriculture, employing 64.2% of urban employment. So this is the economy which needs to be actually upgraded. And that's why I mentioned in the previous lecture, which I gave on science, technology, innovation policy, when Jose was there, and I was mentioning that's precisely the economy requires the local, LIPS approach. And some of us have done experiments in this particular exercise as a part of the people science movement. Some of you are familiar with my work on that. That's the kind of work which provides actually a pathway. And that particular pathway is critically important, and that can actually bring self-reliance for the huge economy as far as it's concerned. But even the formal economy, that particular, I'll come to that. But this particular economy, to the extent that some of the gains were made to provide certain succor, that was to the employment guarantee schemes. In fact, all the money that was allocated has been spent already in the first 3 months. And at the moment, the Maharajh scheme payments are not being made. Employment scheme is in place. Similarly, wages are not being received by the people. That's complaint coming from all over the country. Similarly, if you look at, there is another called Garib Kalyan Yojana, which means people poor welfare plan as far as it's concerned. It's a largely a PSU's money which was used, but there was for 26 districts were chosen, 116 districts were chosen for 125 days. People who returned back in the rural areas, people went from Bombay, Delhi, Pune, Chennai, all over places back to their home. Migrants, the 40 million migrants whom I talked about. These people, when they went back, for them, this just a very much a policy which would not give sustained employment, no sustainable livelihood. The money being used precisely for actually not creating the conditions for sustainable and development in those particular areas. And there's a lot to be done, in fact, whether to fix urban question or the industrial side. And simultaneously, if you look at in this particular place, still 49.5% of the people in India, that's close to 50%. And if you look at, depend on agriculture still, though that contributes to maybe 15 or 13% of the total GDP at the moment, as far as it's concerned. But the income share is very small, but the employment that it has to take on is very huge. And if you look at that whole thing, in that, again, further now contract farming through that, as well as through other means, the land question is in new ways coming into the thing. Because a lot of encroachments taking place on the commons as far as is concerned, and whatever struggles, democratic struggles were taken on, and there is a reversal of land reforms in Karnataka, is a state next to KJ's area, where a certain amount of struggle is already very much on. Same is the case with the Madhya Pradesh, where also the struggle is on. Similarly, if you look at the kind of things which have to be done to break the structures of informality, in the case of in agriculture, the 3 ordinances which I talked about, they're going to be bringing further informality as far as it's concerned. The solution, the pathways do come. And there have been ways, and what I would hear broadly, like when Rasigan was discussing, he was discussing the certain kinds of transition, but the kind of transition which we would consider where the reassigning on the means of production to the peasants and artisans. At the same time, simultaneously, the coercive element of the state goes down, and with the withering of the state, these are the two important, challenges that we face. They can be faced through a pathway of called peasant, artisan, rural workers economy. Those who will remember, if whatever vision which we have of the future world as far as is concerned, in fact, in the rudimentary networks of the peasant, artisan, and rural workers economy, there are no big traders till now. But now they will come in, and now these large Adanis and Ambanis are going to come into that particular. Till now they were not there, so they were opening through the pathways to industrial upgrading, and number of people science movements, experiments have been there, and these are very akin to similar to what the LIPS approach as far as is concerned. These were the structures which were available to us. These informality structures, even one can find space in them, and these are different kinds of structures of informality than even what the informality structures we found in cities as far as is concerned. Coming to the next slide, please, where I would give you an idea. Please, next slide, please, Marcelo. See, this unsustainable path of economic development, which was whose features can be described, which is not the path which I was suggesting that could actually provide opportunities and openings for self-reliance. But this unsustainable path of economic development, if its figures are seen, if you say that in fact, the employment, the growth rates were very high. In fact, the whole decade of 2000, as far as is concerned, but the employment intensity was very low. And if you can look at employment elasticity figures, the details are discussed here. But of course, much of this employment which was even created, though it was not remunerative, but our estimates of unemployment show that it was growing. That it used to be 18 to 27 people per thousand between 2004-5 to 2011-12, grew in to 38 and 50 per thousand persons for 2011-12 and 2015. Of course, COVID is a totally different scale altogether. Next slide, please. If you, I have already discussed agriculture. Yeah. Please, next slide. Yeah. So if you look at, jobs offered have been of a temporary nature, no written contracts, and casualization grew. And even in formal sector, which used to have written contracts at one time, now they decided to go into non-written and formal, non-standard employment, casual workers, etc. There was a lot of privatization taking place even in public services and public employment. Therefore, yesterday only the Indian, Delhi government has decided to privatize part of the public services, water, as far as it's concerned. So employment would be created in a casual mode, and this is what's going to happen, and this is an attack on this precisely Delhi Jal Board. And that's been happening in power, that's been happening across the board as far as in different services area. Now, so if you look at, a lot of it is linked to the austerity measures, which are part, monetarist policies, which have made government go for that particular route. That's cut on social expenditure, capital expenditure in the official budget has been going down. Rising share of entrance payments in agriculture, fiscal spending, and these have had contractionary effects. And if you look at the FRBMA, which I mentioned about it, how the fiscal deficit has to be, it is all under the influence of the finance capital. Finance capital is determining, in fact, the way the state should intervene, because it is, though financialization of the households has not occurred to such an extent, but the industrial economy, if you, in certain sectors, it's about 14% or so financialization, but in other cases, it's been lower. But financialization has impacted on the way the state should function as far as this is concerned. If the next slide, please, Marcelo, can I go over to the, see, if we have to build in this particular ecosystem as it exists as far as it's concerned, if it is to be transformed it cannot be, sustainability and social inclusion cannot be achieved through a moral discourse or even an apocalyptic discourse or fear, prejudice, stigma, and superstitions. In fact, or also false optimism, no doubt about it. And we got to have actually people realizing that it's a political question, a political responsibility for organizing the people for structural and system changes. We're not just asking for climate change, but we're asking for system change. So this transition which has to have is to be, of course, one can discuss it, what does this system change mean and so on, etc. But it's a very clear question that will require a huge amount of political and ideological contestation and openness. And that's why, in fact, if you look at the 50s and 60s and 70s, about which I talked in detail, and the 80s in my science, technology, innovation policy lecture, that's also on YouTube available, that because there was an accommodation of diversity and plurality because of the political contestation which had gone on in the course of the freedom movement. And as a result, multiple sources of initiative existed, different pathways existed, but that particular diversity and plurality and multiple sources of initiative were lost over the period in the 90s, 2000s, and this particular decade, and homogenization, commodification, and so on, etc. examples. If you go to the next slide, please, Marcelo, please. So see, if you, in terms of knowledge production, there's a very interesting part that this state is no more willing to use its statistical system. Indian statistical system used to be one of the strongest statistical systems. You have all heard of Maharajh's plan, industrial pathway to industrialization. And Maharajh was a statistician, and he built the Indian statistical system along with his lot of comrades, and Nehruvian to the core, and that used to be the system through which we could monitor and observe. But on the labor and livelihoods, our data is so scanty at the moment, and much of the knowledge that we have to gain on really the poor as far as is concerned. 90% of the economy is informal, and that means also it's not, knowledge about it is not generated in the normal knowledge production system. The science itself does not cover them as far as is system does not extend its arms and helping hand to them, and this responsibility has fallen on many of us. And as a result, the challenge of mobilizing professionals, practitioners, and I can tell you many of the professionals and practitioners did come forward, but a large number of them did not also get active, and they are still to be activized as far as it's concerned, and that they should be activized in a manner that they really empathy gets and solidarity they show with the people. So that's the challenge before the democratic movement as far as it's concerned, even in respect of knowledge production as far as it's concerned, because this state is sitting in denial and it's deception, and at the moment that's the challenge we face with regard to very much breaking this curse that India has at the moment ended up in. And as a result, a lot of our science institutions, social science institutions, science institutions would have to be transformed in a big way. That's a subject in itself. I won't deal with it now. Next slide, please. Yeah. Yeah, and I think I'm reaching the last two slides as far as it's concerned. And I think the elements of denial, deception are mentioned, weak state capacities are mentioned, but the factors responsible for the deepening of crisis policies which I have mentioned, if they have to be dealt with, then I think the mobilization has to be on the lines of all lives matter. And that's been clear as a response from the democratic movement. And struggle is on to mobilize farmers, to women, students, and left and democratic movement is possibly at the moment the hope. In fact, the Center Party or Congress Party, it made a lot of compromises with the right-wing ideology during the last 3-4 decades, as far as is concerned. Has to itself be woken up as far as that's the challenge also has fallen on the left and democratic movement as well, because larger alliances required to defeat the authoritarian populism and the fascist possibilities which are there very much in this particular regime. The last point which I want to say, that the required agility as far as is concerned on the part of the left-wing democratic movement is a big challenge for us as far as is concerned. And my last slide really comes from the fact that the way one needs to conceptualize the agility, interventions of the democratic movement. I think the broader view of the innovation system, with Jose, Helena, and Rasigan, and I, all of us, and Joseph, all of us have been wedded towards, and various other friends whom I am not named as far as is concerned. Yeah, they have been actually talking about this broader view. This broader view has been precisely talking about of the innovation system, has been talking about the transformation mode. That is spaces for transformative information. Transformations require larger structures have to be changed, transformed, and that broader view lens now is coming under discussion and in the innovation system theory. But I think there's a lot of interventions are required today. Again, that challenge is cannot be discussed in detail as far as is concerned. But I think the social functions of science, and I'm reminded of J.D. Barna, I'm reminded of Needham, I'm reminded of people who have contributed to saying the role of science, role of technology and innovation is actually to really provide means and facilities for reflexivity. And we need it very much in an era where we are dealing with a lot of uncertainties, but there are many of them are known unknowns, and they can be dealt with, and responsible innovations can be actually and the self-organization, as I mentioned, extended peer review in itself, the institutions of science or of finance, they are not in themselves going to serve the goals of transformation unless there is an open public scrutiny. Innovation systems have to really play the role of changing the power structure, be in domains of economy or education or everywhere. That's the I think role which scholars of innovation system can play only if they link themselves closely with the democratic movement. That's my the last point, and I think I close with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your very interesting speech. It's this online meeting apps avoid us from giving a big applause for both of the speakers, because there are so many interesting contributions and it's so silent after all of that. But let's move on. So please we'll invite our fellow Gabriela Podcameni to give her comments on the presentations and actually contributing to the debate by providing some perspectives of the Brazilian experience in the last months, how we are dealing with all of it.
Thank you, Marcelo. Good morning to everyone, or good evening, or maybe even good night to some. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's also a challenge to comment on such interesting presentations and such a complex theme. So I was asked to do a brief presentation also on the Brazilian case. So I will do that, and I made some notes, and I'll try to highlight the similarities and the important points that were made by Professor Rasigan and Professor Abrol. But I know it would be impossible because they were very deep presentations. So I begin saying that I'm sorry if I miss any important points, and I trust that my fellows, Cassiolato and Marcelo, can pick up on anything that I miss out, and also the debate that will happen afterwards. So let me see. Is it, I'm sharing my screen. Is it first technological effort? Is it, can you see it, the presentation? I don't think it's showing. Marcelo, you also have my presentation, so if it doesn't show, can you please put it on screen for me, just as you did to Abrol? Yes, it's not showing. I think Marcelo can help me. It's the last one, the 6, the version 6, yes, thank you. Okay. Let me see. Okay. You can pass on the first one, please, Marcelo. Yes. So I will begin. The idea I will begin in talking a little bit specific about the COVID-19 in Brazil, and then I will do some relations to a broader context that we are seeing. And in this, I will mention many things that were mentioned by Abrol and Rasigan, and then I will talk about the government project that we have and the global project and the privatization of natural resources that we're also facing here. Okay. So as my colleagues has already highlighted, the COVID-19, I think the most important message that we must realize is that it amplifies the already cruel inequality. So I'm going to show a little bit of some data here in Brazil to show the dimension of how cruel this pandemic is and how it already amplifies the inequality that exists previously. So Brazil is the 3rd country in the world in total cases of coronavirus and the 2nd number in death. Despite having impact the gains of most workers, it hits specifically those who are working in informality. So the data that I present here are from IPEA that were just launched, and they did some data from May of this year to show how the COVID had different impact in the workers. Abrol and Rasigan also mentioned these data, and it's the same pattern in Brazil. We have the informality group that received, in average, 60% of their income. Employers also had a sharp drop in their income due to the rules of the social isolation. I have these data, I didn't present them in details, but we had the most drop was tourism, food sector, restaurants, and also transportation. So I have them here, we can put on the debate. The public sector, the military sector, hardly saw this income affected by the pandemic. And of course, we also had a very strong impact on the earlier people, more strongly than the younger. And this relates to a little bit of what Rasigan also showed of the South African population, the age, and we can pick that up a little bit in the debate. And of course, as expected, the schooling has a very strong effect. So people with high school complete had a bigger impact, a lower income than those that had higher education, of course. And I think this last data is very significant. It shows that 32% of the domiciles didn't have income that came from work. So you can see that the income from work has a very strong decline, which shows the challenge of the society. And we have 5% that didn't have any source of income, only the emergency help that was given by the government, which I would like to debate at the end of this presentation. But just to introduce a little bit for our foreign colleagues, the emergency help was not the idea of the federal government. It was the opposition that united and had a win. So, and it was very important. Otherwise, we would have 3 million people without any source of income for food, for anything. So this shows a little bit what I want to pick up at the end for the need of to debate a universal minimal income that I think is one of the things that was already raised by the colleagues. Another dimension, I think Rasigan also showed very interesting data, was the remote work. And of course, if you're allowed to do remote work, you can be much more protected from the pandemic. But this was a privilege to only few of the population. So this most was people from 30 to 39, around 40 years, white, and with higher education. So you have a very high percentage of the population that were not able to do it and will not. So it's much more exposed to the coronavirus. So less educated and non-white are much more exposed. This is also an IPEA data. You can pass, Marcelo. And this is a paper that was just released from IPEA, and some colleagues of us, Gabriela Zucoloto, that's here, was co-authored with Priscila Coelher, and I think Pedro Miranda also. And it shows how I think what Rasigan said at the end, we're not in the same boat. We're definitely not in the same boat. The study in Rio shows that COVID, you can kill, you have the probability to kill 3 times more in the less developed neighborhoods if you're in the population between the age of 30 and 59. There's some debate on this data, because just like the other colleagues showed, the testing here in Brazil is very unequal. So in the less developed neighborhoods, you also have less testing. And we also will have the difference on public sector. So just as South Africa, we also have a public and private health system, and I'll address that when I talk about gender in the next slide. And we also have, Abrol also said that very directly, the lack of water. So how can you protect yourself and if you don't, and stay at home if you don't have water in your house? You can't wash your hands. So this was a very challenging. So this in the north and northeast regions, this was a higher challenge, but this was also addressed in this southeast, like in favelas or in communities. So this stressed out this existing problem, but it made it much more challenging during the COVID pandemic. The educational system is the same thing. You have in richer territories, of course, you already have the better schools. You have private schools and public schools here in Brazil. And we have 27% of the primary and secondary schools do not have access to internet. And 44 of the schools do not are served with public water system. So this complicates the return to classes and will reinforce even more the inequality. So, and will expose the students even more. You can pass a little bit. And of course, I think it's very important to outline the gender perspective of the crisis, which was already highlighted a little bit by my colleagues. Women, especially the poorest and head of the households, and with children have been affected in several ways: loss of income, lack of daycare centers and schools, and I put and highlight the increase of unpaid work. Unfortunately, most of the unpaid work related to care is done by female. So that makes in the pandemic this amount of unpaid work related to care has increased significantly, and is a matter that must be discussed in our society. But as all the things that I have been pointing out, these were already existing problems that were only amplified by this sanitary crisis. Increase of domestic violence and homicides of women in 14 states of Brazil. The data of this are extremely impressive and sad, and we have some states which it's over 100% of the increase of domestic violence, and this is also a barrier for the females that in the crisis that should be addressed immediately. The housekeeper, we have 6 million women in Brazil working with the housekeeping, and that's a very high possibility of contamination and vulnerability. You are in someone other's house, you don't control their body, where they go, their habits, you're cleaning their things, and it's an environment with a high probability of getting contaminated. And it's not just to show, in Rio, the first death by coronavirus was housekeeping that was taking care of a fancy house apartment at Leblon, and her employer went from Italy, and of course he survived and she died. And why is that? Why am I bringing this example? Because this shows what was pointed out as the very different health system that you will have access. So the employee is the one that goes to Italy, gets sick, and she still has to work in the house, and she gets when she gets ill, she's going to a less prepared health system than she will. It's a matter of very strong injustice, and it is a social choice to maintain this. So this example is only one example, but it highlights a cruelty. The women represent 70% of the health professionals, reaching 80% in areas like nursing. The lack of the equipment protection, which is what happened a lot in the public service, is pointed out as the biggest threat of contamination to this professional health. And Brazil, unfortunately, was the champion on health coronavirus for the health professionals, especially nursing. So that also reveals how unprepared the system is, and the burden goes mainly to the women. Additional, Brazil, unfortunately, is the champion of maternal death by COVID. And this is a data that reveals how the pregnant women don't have access to the health system properly, and this inequity and this cruelty. And in this case, the racial dimension is also very present. Please, Marcelo. So what I'm just trying to show some dimensions, and I can go on and on, unfortunately, but the most important message that was already strengthened out by my colleague is COVID pandemic is one more dimension of a multi-dimensional crisis, and reveals some consequences here in Brazil of the governmental dismantling that has been happening in the country. And this was said previously by Abrol and Rasigan, and especially when Abrol says the privatization of natural resources, of the state capabilities, of and the austerity measurements. So the COVID cannot be analyzed without associating with this project. So it's the governmental dismantling project to remove any limitation to the capital expansion and destroy diversity. So, and then this happens in too many dimensions, but I'll highlight, you have the dismantling of, like, for example, I'm just getting the environmental government utilities as an example, but, and you also have another strategy, which is also extremely cruel, is the promotion of the loss of credibility and criminalization of teaching, science, research, thinking, environmental activists, human rights activists. This is what we're doing. So you have, like, the loss of privilege, of credibility, and criminalization. So 3 days ago, our Minister of Education said, and I quote my translation, but it's quoted, Today, to be a professor is to have a declaration that the person could not do anything else. So then this is repeated by society over and over again. And so the strategy to attack the areas of unit of conservation, because it represents, for example, the limit for agribusiness expenditure, attacked any barrier to the real estate interest, allowed many agri-talks that are forbidden. I have these other data, but I'm not going to give you details. Weakening any institution related to development, and of course, weaken all environment institutions and regulation, promote racism, homophobia, machismo, ethnicity. So you can pass, Marcelo. I'm not, since I have lack of time, and I really want to go to the end, so where we can discuss. I will just present now the 5 slides that I have, only the title and the dimension and the measurements of the government. I could pass on for my friends. It's in English in translation, and also the regional source. So we have the dismantling of the environmental government entities. For I just want to highlight, I will not highlight all the things that they have been doing, but the CONAMA, which is the National Environmental Council, which is a very important space to regulate and to determine all the changes of the laws in the environmental aspects of Brazil. So when he attacked that and reduced the numbers of scholars and NGOs in this council, he opened the possibilities for all the destruction that will happen and is happening afterwards. So and when I went to South Africa, I told you a lot that I was very concerned on the change of the CONAMA. And what we are facing now is that the very fast destruction, because the CONAMA, which was the main protector, is weakened. So unfortunately, I was right on being, I think I spoke like 10 minutes only about this. And unfortunately, I was right. And then we can talk more about the very, very fast destruction that's happened. You can pass my phone, please. And the budget for environmental matters, of course. So we have very sharp reduction of the budget. It's not been used. And the end of the Amazon fund that's been discussing. This is a sentence that the president said, take this money and go reinforce Germany. He said this in August 15th. You can pass, Marcelo. I'm going to, this is just a graph showing the green part is just showing how the deforestation in the Amazon is growing fast. If you can look, we have a historical decline. Especially in the decades of the Workers' Party, and then you can see an increase. And then, but then what I wanted to highlight is you can see if the yellow line, and you can see the infraction notes, the fees are declining a lot. And then in the I put here the quote by the president, let's end the fine industry. So it is a project. It's a project not to allow the deforestation. And I think this sentence with this graph show how it's not. It's a project. So you can pass it, Marcelo, please. The burning crisis, which unfortunately world known. I'll address the two. This is the Amazon, and the red spots are all the fires. And this is here there is also the budget for fire control preventing, and you can see it's reducing. And this is a photo of São Paulo, 3 p.m. And you can see that São Paulo has turned into night because of the fog and of the burnings. So it's very a structured problem. And of course, and there's a sentence saying that it's not happening, that the burnings are not happening. You can pass on, please. And then right now we are facing the loss of Pantanal. Pantanal is one of the largest continuous wetlands in the planet and is protected international by Hansmark Convention. And then this data, I like when a very simple data presents a very complex context. So you can see it from 2000 to 2018. So we lost in Pantanal 2,100 square kilometers. That was, and then only in 2020, the loss of Pantanal was 23,000 square kilometers. So this shows, I can't even compare, like more than 10 times more in 1 year than almost in a decade. I think that's a fair comparison. You can pass, please. And then you have, of course, the increase of rural violence, militarization, press censorship, crackdown on activists and civil servants. So it's a project, and these are the bases. So to sustain what we were talking previously of the expansion of the capital, the privatization of the capabilities of the states, of the natural resources. So you have the militarization and all the environmental agencies, taking out the scholars and the analysts and putting military censorships. You're not allowed anymore. The people in the agency cannot give interviews, cannot pass data to the press. It has to have this code of ethic conduct, which prohibits them to pass on documents. So it's based on violence. You can pass on. So it's there's many dimensions, and this is the only one that I would like to highlight a little bit, because I think it's one of the most important, that how this system works, this project of destruction. It's the fake news and the science deniers. So the fake news as an important mechanism. In 371 days, the president gave 618 false or distorted statements. This is the graph of the fake news that grows every day. Only the official ones that I'm talking about. And these are some of them. Now, you cannot end deforestation and burning. It's cultural. The Amazon is not being devastated or consumed by the fire. And this is a lie told by the media. So this confusion on fake news and science and deniers, which has connection of the loss of credibility of science, of scholars, of research and science that I told in the beginning. So these are all the dimensions. In NGOs, it's almost criminal to be an NGO. Yes, you can pass, please. So, and what's happening in Brazil, it's not the Brazilian story. It's we can see it in many parts of the world and growing. When it begins, it's a little bit different, but the story is very similar. So you have economic, environmental, social, political, ethical crisis, a multiple crisis, fake news narrative, a narrative war. The ideas that protecting the environment is an obstacle to the growth, criminalization of activism of the public servant, criminalization of STI, criminalization of education, teaching, researching, the finance of power and the limitation of the state in its policy, the capture of the public interest from corporation, which was told a lot. I think Abrol also said that a lot, the financialization and its power. Rasigan addressed that a lot, how to change, you have to change the power structure and how to get that back. The colonizing thinking, the policies, the colonizing policies, and how it got inside the country and how it's hard to defend. And all of that is linked in the middle with the criminalization of the state and the public policy. So you have to get back the state capabilities to get out of this crisis. You can pass a little bit more, please, Marcelo. And, but so what the main argument is, you have this crisis, this multidimensional crisis, and this project, the privatization, the dismantling of the government, the state, the weakness of the state, the capabilities, and then you have the COVID. And the COVID-19 what happens is that in Brazil, the pandemic is serving to accelerate the process of destruction of the institutes, the environment and the social environment and cultural diversity of the country. So this is a quote by the Salles, our I even hate to say the Ministry of Environment, and he said the pandemic is an opportunity. The government should take advantage of the moment when the focus of society and the media is on the new coronavirus to change the rules that could be questioned injustice. According to him, it would be time to make any changes in the rules and avoid criticism and lawsuit. And then he said, I quote, "We do not need the Congress." So instead of putting the opportunity to do a shift in the transformation that we're talking, what's actually happening in Brazil is the other way around. But even though and how the process is not linear and there is paradox. Sorry, the pandemic has also made it very clear the relevance of the state capacity building. And then, so what happened is the tragedy in Brazil was not higher, specifically because of what we had from previous decade of the state capability and the social programs. So the universal minimum income that I was talking about was only possible in such a short term due to the Bolsa Familia, which had everybody register. So we use that to give the universal minimum income. So if we don't have one, we cannot have the other. And it's the same thing. So like we had Fiocruz, and Fiocruz, our health institute, was very important so that the tragedy wouldn't be even bigger. We had SUS, our universal public free health system, that yes, it has also some private areas, but it's universal, it's public for the access. So what we're saying that is that it showed that what saved us for not being even higher is exactly the social programs, the capability, the industrial capabilities that we still had that would manage to get through. And of course, so the pandemic showed that very clearly. And then, of course, the importance of the local dimension. And Abrol talked a lot about food. And this very similar thing, Abrol, happened in Brazil. So the price, the government also did not distribute the food. In Brazil, the same thing. We opened up for exporting. We continued that. We had a rise on the prices, very significant. And what saved was the local agriculture. So the local agriculture did not increase their prices. And the familiar workers in the agriculture, and that helped the system to maintain it. And it was very important when we see what happened through the production of drugs and equipment and health equipment, and we see the competition between the countries, how important it is to produce nationally, locally, food, health equipment, drugs, research, science, and the myth of that it doesn't, of course it's a myth, but it's shown again, history has shown one more time that no, it's not the same thing to product or to import. No, when the crisis come, national and your country will give priority or should give priority. So you see like the United States flying through China and stealing the drugs that was going to France. And you see how it's important to have national capabilities. And of course, it also shown something that was also very stressed in the previous presentation, the importance of digital sovereignty, the debate on cybersecurity. Once we saw how important life, what we're doing now through internet, the importance of having that as a national defense, as national security issue. So privacy for the citizens, regulation for the corporation, prohibiting to use the personal data for commercial and political purposes. That, again, is something that was already a main problem in our society that should be addressed, which is one of the main threats of democracy nowadays. And now in this pandemic has also been highlighted, the importance of digital inclusion and importance of criminalization fake news, which we don't address it properly. Pode passar? Pass, please. I'm getting to the end. And this is just, I will not, it's not all the dimensions necessary, just a brief exercise of how to think the world and some elements, not all, please, and only an exercise. So in the middle, we have to have the state capabilities, capacities, the public policy. I also addressed the, I think Rasigan stressed that a lot, pointed out the public interest in the public goods and the importance of the difference between the self-interest and the common interest, and how the public goods and the public interest must be the ones to guide the governance. The dimension of the local and the national was once more pointed out. The local production of food, so the food system was shown as being absolutely essential to be one of the prior areas. The national system of innovation of health, which we already studied a lot in the BRICS project, and how it's the main driver for this pandemic and the future pandemics and the future crisis. Systemic policies of science, technology, and innovation, decolonize the thinking, of course, so digital sovereignty, debate, cyber, on security, privacy for citizens, regulation for the corporation. Again, I'm an activist on that. The universal of a minimal income and social and programs, SDGs goals, which I'll link to the questions that I'm going to make to the professors. And of course, we also have the always debate on the green agenda. And Rasigan, I really want to know what the purple agenda is, please. And I'm very curious. And but you have to think on renewable energy, bioeconomy, and green inclusive transformation, of course, but it has to be linked to decent jobs, because it's not always linked in the literature. To gender perspective, most of the green economy jobs that are going to be created are male jobs. So that will increase the inequality of gender. Once again, green does not guarantee female inclusion in most literature. So we should address it. Linked, that's very important, to decent jobs, because the attack on jobs are being very strong. So we can talk more about these, please, Marcelo. And then it's just some issues. So, and then I'll link a little bit to the SDGs and the green package that we're talking. It's possible, as I've presented, to see many similarities from Brazil, India, South Africa. And in having that on mind, I ask, what are the importance of the cooperation in BRICS in the scenario of this multiple crisis, in the BRICS corporation, in removing the obstacles to really promote the inclusive and sustainable development? So how, in specific dimensions, can we address these common challenges? There are very many green recovery plans being announced in the world, some in Brazil, which I didn't have much time to talk, such as the Green New Deal. What are the reach of these package, in your opinion? Do you believe that they are able to promote the sustainable and inclusive development under which conditions? I have some criticism on them a little bit. Many scholars have pointed out the possibility of this sanitary crisis, that it could be a possibility to strengthen the green agenda. It could, but in Brazil, we're not seeing that case very much. But what are the changes that are needed on this current crisis to become a possibility to transformation and to promote inclusive and sustainable development. But political, and that's why I was going to put the political in caps locks, but then I would induce a response. And economic factors should be strengthened, and how can we achieve that? And regarding the SDGs, I read a paper that provoked me, saying that he believes that actually this current crisis will weaken SDGs. Could, he asked this paper, could the magnitude of the crisis in the sanitary, economic, financial, and social terms sideline a long-term agenda, which are the SDGs, and since we are needing of a immediately response, or no, or will it stress? Pode passar, Marcelo. And just some things, and of course, we all agreed on the strengthening the state capabilities, the public service and the local finance solution, such as adopting local currency. And then this, I think we could pick up more in the debate, the importance of finding the solution of the lack of finance in the world, and we have the local currencies. But do you believe that these debates are the ones taking places in your country, in the world? Is it possible that you say that the local perspective has gained strength in the literature and the debate? Or no, that's only our perspective? On the question of gender specific, does this current scenario represent a retreat in your country, in the world? And is it possible to say that the COVID-19 is a test, a prediction of what will be expressed in the future with greater frequency of climate disaster? And many are pointing out that what we're facing here is what maybe will become more and more frequently. And then the last, if the information sovereignty and data protection, they're not in the SDGs directly. Should they be? Are they like the main questions? Pode passar. So yes, just some ideas, and I know that I didn't relate totally and everything. I have some notes here, but maybe I lost them. But then I think all the group can help us to make the connections. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Gabi, very much for your outline on the Brazilian perspective. When I looked at your PowerPoint, I sent you the comment. It looks like, in Portuguese, pacotinho de maldades. I don't know how to translate it, a package of evil deeds of our central government. And one could add a lot of them which you did not mention. For example, the limitations to credit to small and medium enterprises, where there have been very interesting proposals made by IPEA specialists on that, which have completely disregarded the discourse about tax reform and taxing on fortunes, and something that has also already been put apart. And recently we took a look on the first science, technology, innovation planning document this government put out for the word sustainability or sustainable development. And it just isn't there, not even as a policy statement for looking good. So this gives us a perspective on how this is going. And now the most interesting for the Brazilians, they know it, but for our international guests, our president is now up in public opinion. And that's the funny part of it, right? Because more and more, and it's now the trending topic about the surveillance capitalism and the influence made by platforms and social media and so on. And this poses a big threat for democracy at all. And it's all about having the power, the symbolic power to build visions of the world and to strengthen your political view by that. So I would add one question to Gabi's comments, which is related to what role is there for innovation systems, studies, and action and policy advisory as an effective political transformative tool? Referring to some discussions on that by Rodrigo José and Judith Sutz, for example, they talk about the learning divide and the need for strengthening the basic learning capabilities as substantial freedoms and capabilities of human beings. And at the same time, the movements we see, especially when you weaken public education, when you construct a society based on young people who get informed by selected Facebook prints and things like that, this raises a substantial challenge for really implementing transformation in the sense of building public awareness and majority and implementing transformations by democratic means. So this is the main question I would ask for you too. We have a nice agenda. Rasigan mentioned a lot of it. Dinesh also, and Gabriela made the best scenario plan in her last slide for us. But what about the effective political means and how innovation system, rationale, and studies could contribute for that in practical terms to build new ways to really get implemented and not be in this kind of trap of information or disinformation as we have now. So we are already very late, so I would give the word back to, or I would suggest to collect one or two very, very short questions of the audience if they would like to add. And then I would pass the word back to the presenters. If someone wants to make a question with audio and speaking not more than 1 minute, please tell me. So in case not, I will pass the word back to Professor Rasigan and then Dinesh. In the meanwhile, I can take a look on the chat if you have something. So please, Professor Rasigan.
Well, thanks very much, Marcelo. And thanks very much, Dinesh and Gabi. Really, I enjoyed listening to such sad news. And there's a very good reason for that as well. Besides the resonance, so I should tell you that I don't feel as alone because of what I heard. And that should be a positive statement. The second one is also for all of us to kindly note. Yesterday marked the 50th anniversary of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed in English. I mean, for those of you in Brazil, you saw it in 1968. For the rest of us, we read it after 1970. And I want to respond largely to Marcelo, what you put up at the end, because it also brings a summary point to both what Dinesh has raised as well as Gabriela. And I'm sorry to leave it in this as critical a note as this, and I hope no one gets angry at me. But I think it's important for us to start asking very uncomfortable questions about what it is that we do. Why? Because who is informing a lot of the policy shaping? Ourselves, collectively. Whether we advance the agenda of the right or not, we are contributing to that dialogue itself. So I want to suggest that we really must place a lot more emphasis on being critical about the things we are studying. We must be absolutely clear and explicit about the negative situation that we ourselves are contributing to generating. We cannot at the same time be living the privileges that come from the inequalities, from the ecological devastation, and at the same time be worried about surveillance capital, etc. Who put surveillance capitalism in place? It's our work. on the way in which techno-economic systems change over time. But have we heard anyone from our innovation studies community own up to that responsibility? We are becoming complicit, and because of that, we are becoming culpable as well for the harm we are generating. And I really encourage, that's why I invoke the words of prayer. We need to be very clear. If our work seeks liberation, we cannot then be handmaidens to those destroying the planet. So I hope that's sufficient. I know we could add a lot more, but I hope it also spurs all of us into acting much more radically and stop clapping hands for things that make no sense and basically take us to the firing squad faster. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the comments. Professor Dinesh, Manuel Gonzalo, colleague of ours from Argentina, he asked if you could, beside your comments, also give some words on the pharma industry, the pharma strategies in India in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis. Please, Professor Dinesh. I guess Professor Dinesh is not with us, even if he shows up here. Yes.
Yeah.
No.
I unmuted myself, and I've also revived my photo as well, video. So, see, Manuel was with us in Delhi, and we had a discussion on Indian science technology, and I know that he has done a lot of work on India, and we've seen a few papers which already are there on the net, and congratulations to him. That's point number one. And following on what the question that he has asked, there are three aspects, and there's a really in brief only I can make them, and it's a subject in itself. And pharma, as far as it's concerned, see, India has been a source of supply of medicines to different parts of the country, or to the world, regulated as well as rest of the world markets. No doubt about it. But we also saw during this particular period the supply of disruption of the supply chains as well. You can probably recall that how there was also like vaccine nationalism. There was also IPRs invoked with regard to PPEs as well as masks, like by the US itself, Trump regime as well. And in India too, there was nationalism which was coming into play, like in SCQ case, the hydroxychloroquine, which is a drug which was thought that could provide some relief in certain cases. Like the another case is Remdesivir case also. If you Favipiravir is another case. These are a few of the therapies which were repurposed for COVID, dealing with COVID challenge. And in all these cases, we have seen a lot of irrational behavior also on the part of the Indian pharma, and because the regulatory system was allowing them to only use this drug for emergency purposes. So they should have been used very carefully, but we've seen that they are in open market being sold, which should not have been the case. So practices which are not really legitimate, which are not ethical, which are not responsible, is one aspect which I would like to make mention of. Second is the dimension of APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredient. India over the period, in order to become an exporter, had stopped producing active pharmaceutical ingredients, had become dependent on China, and there was a disruption of the supply chain during this particular period. So for the last about 8 to 10 years, etc., I have been trying both as a person part of the policy community as well as an academic community, focusing on this particular question. But the government was not listening. During this particular period, the government was forced to actually introduce 2 schemes very briefly. One is the product link scheme. There are about 53 products which have been identified. And in the case of all those 53 products, incentives have been provided and so on, etc. If API production, active pharmaceutical ingredient production takes place locally. Second aspect of the API has been the bulk drug paths, because we have had a lot of challenges with regard to both environmental, energy, and other dimensions, as well as API production has to be redone. And I won't get into the details of that, but the schemes, both the schemes which have been introduced, unfortunately do not take into account, again, all the questions which Gabriela was mentioning about them. That is the way these clusters should be planned, the way the new technologies should be adopted, actually, because the pharmaceutical industry is a very pollution intensive industry. People think it's a science-based industry, so it's a industry which does not create any challenges. It does create huge amount of challenges as far as is concerned. So there is a whole area of discussion that I can open up, but I think there's no time for that. But all the technologies which are available with the National Chemical Laboratory or Indian Institute of Chemical Technologies are not going to be used in the scheme, as I see. So all the talk of self-reliance which we have, and as a result linking it to environmental and other questions, very rightly, as Rasigan was pointing out, we can't really falter on that. And Gabriela has also pointed out the whole question of Amazon and in so many other ways. This question is before us. The same is the question here in India, whether our waters, whether it is our soils, how, and antimicrobial resistance. Those who have heard, followed up on the question of that we need new antibiotics, but the new antibiotics are not easy to come by. There's an antimicrobial resistance growing. So there's a huge challenge when you do irrational use of drugs, or the consequences are there, and we are paying a big price for it as far as. And the new innovation is not easily coming in these particular areas. Marcelo was right, and in this particular point, that the innovation systems have to be actually agile and respond to the requirements which are contemporary as far as concerned. A lot of challenges in the case of pharma and vaccines can be discussed. We're not very sure how much success we would get in the case of even vaccine. That's a subject by itself. If I start dealing with it, it will take some time. But the short point which I'm trying to make as far as is concerned is that we may need criteria like something like at least 50% efficacy. That's what people are pointing out in the case of vaccine. But is that sufficient? Oxford, as well as other people who are choosing. Samir is writing about what kind of decolonization in this particular area which needs to be thought of is a very critical question. But the point which I was trying to make with regard to saying is that the vaccines which are going to be evolved, whether they are going to be, apart from being shared, whether they would be actually effective is also a question which we need to ask. And I think there's an open public scrutiny required. Data needs to be shared. And I think the Russians, the Sputnik vaccine data should have been shared long ago. Same is the case with China. Same is should be the case with Oxford and Pfizer and so on, etc. And I think this data is not being shared. They should be put to critical scrutiny. So there is a question of rational use of medicines, pharmaceuticals is very, very important. Like the last point in the case of pharma, which is very, very clear that, in the case of pharma, has been depending on wholly owned subsidiaries. It's of outward foreign direct investment, which has grown. And I'm going to really cut it short, Manuel. Otherwise, I'm doing a lot of injustice to friends who are wanting to leave, And the short point, which I'm conscious of it, that, it's getting late. So for me in India, it's already about 9:30. in the night. And so the short point which I'm trying to make as far as is concerned is that the directionality of the innovation system, the pharmaceutical innovation system, is a big question. You can look at my paper on August 30th in the EPW, Economic Political Weekly, which has been mentioned. A book is coming out on the outward foreign direct investment. If I start getting into the details of how the Indian pharmaceutical multinationals are doing irresponsible things, it will take me a full webinar. Thank you very much, Manuel. I'm not going to go more into it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all of you. And since we didn't have new questions raised by the audience,
can I leave, Manuel, Marcelo? If there's any question to me, can it be directed to me now? Huh?
Yeah.
Okay, I have got a guest at home. She's a leader of the women's movement, and she was arrested yesterday. I just want to at least greet her.
So thank you very much, Professor Dinesh. I will pass on to Professor Cassiolato to still say goodbye also.
Yeah, Jose wants to say, I don't want to leave without, really sorry, it's a big battle going on the women's front. There are 2 women who have been raped, and they've been raped by upper caste and men, and there's a huge amount of movement building up, like in the farmers. It's also among the women as well. Jose, sorry if I am seeking permission in between.
Okay.
Yes, Amir, Lal Salam. Yes, let's salute.
Okay, well, we've been here for almost 3 hours, and I totally understand Dinesh's problem. People keep saying that more than 2 hours of webinar makes our health worse. And then let's just finish thinking, first of all, that next week we'll have a sort of continuation of this fantastic discussion we had today. And I really want to thank my friends, our friends Dinesh, Rasigan, and Gabi for the excellent presentation and the points you raised. I think some of them will certainly be dealt with later on. And just to make things very short, one of the things that came, and Rasigan already pointed this out in the chat, is that taking into account huge, significant historical, social, institutional, political difference, there are huge similarities that have been shown in the presentations regarding what's happening in COVID in our countries during COVID. Without making it very simple, I would say that most of the similarities have to do with the specificities and effects of financiarization that are happening in our world in the last 40 years, and that really deepened after the 2008 crisis. And one of the things that deepened a lot since then is the total capture of the state as a whole and of its bureaucracies in particular. In the sense that the policies that have been discussed, the policies that have been implemented are totally totally captured by this relation of finance and state. It's not a problem of our IBSA countries. It's a problem that's happening in Europe. It's a problem that's happening in different parts of the world. And unless all of the things that we discussed here are dealt with, trying to connect with the effect of financiarization, we won't go much further. One of the things that came from our discussion, of course, is that, again, and for us it's a bit obvious, but again, territory and geography matters. And I hope that next week we'll do with that. Dinesh told about the informality in India. Rasigan also mentioned about that. And we have some examples here in Brazil, and Dinesh was very kind to again mention our LIPS, Local Innovation Systems approach, and how we're dealing with this. I think that next week we'll do with that. But again, thanks a lot for the excellent discussion. All of this will be available in our website, at YouTube and also in the website. And looking forward to see you again, friends. It's been fantastic to convene again after our last meeting in Tshwane in January, and we hope that we can do this together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll have to leave. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rasigan. Thank you, Abrol. Thank you, Cassiolato.
Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.
Marcelo.
See
Catch
you.
up with you all next week again.
Rasigan, kisses to your girls there. Missing you.
Yes.
I'll have to go and get them as well. Bye, people.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.
Good seeing you, Samir, as well.
Thank you.
Good.
Flávio. Eu adoro ver quem fica.